The poem we're going to read today is Fire and Ice by Robert Frost. And once again, I would urge you to read the poem below, and there's a little bit of Wikipedia that I pasted into that for your interest. Some say the world will end in fire. Some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction ice is also great and would suffice. And would suffice. Okay. If you've read the Wikipedia below, you'll see that there is a kind of a debate about the genesis of where Frost got the idea for this poem. That does not concern me now, although it is of interest. Nonetheless, I would like to turn to Genesis, to Bereshit, because the destruction of the world in the Torah's telling of the creation of the world and the subsequent events really goes through two stages, two reasons that God destroys the world. And the nature of that destruction and the way it is connected to desire and the way that it is connected to hate are fairly clear themes. What are these two endings? Let us begin with the first. The first ending of the world is the world that the humans lived in was a world of perfection. It was the world of Gan Eden. But that's going to end. And why is it going to end? It's going to end because there is a tree. All the trees were mahmadim. But there was a tree, one tree. It was the tree of knowledge, the Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that is at the root of this. And what happens? What happens? They're told not to eat of it. And God, who saw in all of creation, who sees that everything is good, and indeed everything is tov ma'od, is very good. The woman, who is the first human who looks at something with the verb to see in Hebrew, she sees the fruit of the tree. And she sees the fruit of the tree is nechmad. It is desirable. It is ta'ava. These two words for desire, I'm not going into a semantic field of what the difference between them is, but these two words appear again later in the Aseret HaDibrot, where we are told in the first Dibrot, in Shmot, we are told, Lo tachmod, do not desire, Beit Re'acha, the house of your, and then, Lo tachmod, Eshet Re'acha, the wife of your neighbor. In Devarim, in Parshat V'Etchanan, the word Lo tachmod applies to Eshet Re'acha and Lo tit'aveh, the other word for desire, appears to what in Dvarim is the 10th commandment, all the other things, the house and so on and so forth. But the woman sees this, and out of unlimited desire, okay, what comes into the world are death, destruction, and banishment from Eden. They can no longer be in Eden. And that's the first stage of destruction, number one. The second stage comes not out of desire, if you will, but out of hate. And where does the hate come from? God, so it seems, chooses to favor Hevel. Hevel brings Gamhu, he brings himself, as the Kutzker says it, to the carbon, to the sacrifice. He brings the best. Cain doesn't. And Cain is filled with anger. He's filled with hate. And what comes into the world? Death. Death comes into the world. Because before a human being has died in the normal, quote, normal course of events as part of God's new design of the world, if you will. But what happens here is that Cain takes the matter into his own hands and brings death into the world. I have become God, destroyer of worlds, and he kills his brother. And the result of that action is further banishment. Further banishment. Cain becomes a nad ba'aretz. He's not rooted to any spot. He becomes the wanderer. He becomes the nomad. And that too is a banishment. Those are the two stages of desire and hate of the world ending. But that's a limited world. It gets bigger, if you will. And there appear in Bereshit the Bnei Elohim, which represents Bnei, I say Elohim, because they are, the simple meaning of the term is that they are the powerful people, and they take whatever women they want to take. Mibnot Adam. They exercise their power. Unbridled desire. And then God says, he begins, as it were, to think about destruction. Man, there's something rotten at the core. And this comes to fruition in Noach, when God says, I'm going to destroy the world, and I will destroy it with the stuff of the coldness of man's heart, when the warmth of water becomes destructive, becomes, if you will, poetically, ice. Ki hishchit kol basar et darko al haaretz. Everything is corrupt. Everything is corrupt. And the world ends in water that is frozen as the hate in the heart of man. Now, let us think about, when we talk about the hate in the heart of man, okay? Because this appears again. Because in the end, the world was destroyed once, but it could sink into perdition again. And God says, Vayarach Hashem et reach hanichoach, when Noah comes out of the teva, and God says, as it were, God, as it were, realizes, Ki yetzer leiv ha'adam raminu rav. Man is evil from his. Now, how shall we translate yetzer leiv ha'adam? Man's inclination of his heart is evil from Ne'urav, from his birth. Well, that would certainly sound like original sin, okay? Or Minurav, I once heard from Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, means we are shaped Minurav by those associations we have in our years of maturation. Well, this corresponds to two Skinnerian theories, B.F. Skinner theories of that sort of denies free will, that we are born shaped by heredity and shaped by society, by those around us. But of course, there is Jewishly free will. So what does this mean, min urav? If you look at Rashi says what appears to be strange. Rashi says, Nu'urav is written without the vav that could be placed. A letter is missing. So Minurav can be read not from his youth, but min'arav, in which the root verb of the Hebrew word, which is that of a youth, the root verbal form of that is to be stirred up. And Rashi goes on and says, Mishanin'ar lotzeit mimei imo nichnas bo yetzer hara. It is in the human condition that from the time we are stirred up to go out of the womb, the yetzer hara, the evil inclination, enters. Right? The yetzer tov will only come later. What does this mean? So I've pondered about this a lot until it struck me one day that it's simply about the nature of the human condition. We are born like an animal. We go through birth pains. Until then, it was all about us. Chazal even picture it that way. We're taught Torah. We're in a perfect idyllic world. Physically, again, it's the idyllic world. It's a perfectly temperature controlled. I don't have to worry about what food I'm going to eat. When I'm uncomfortable, I give a kick, and the mother suffers. So what? It's about me, me, me. And we are born with our fists clenched, angry, screaming, I. And you could capitalize that I. The only personal pronoun in English that is capitalized is I, numero uno, number one. That's what we're talking about. Is we are all born as narcissistic personalities, and it is about us and the human condition for which God is willing to save the world because he recognizes that it is possible for us to struggle against it. And indeed, the Torah is a guidebook to struggle against it, right? The narcissistic personality is the way we are born, and growing up is not the possibility, is not the impossibility of changing, but growing up is the possibility of being a giving person rather than always a taking person, okay? But if we don't grow up, we remain narcissistic personalities. The narcissistic personality will not know what the rights of the other or the dignity of the other. It's only, as I said, I. The narcissistic personality will not understand what self-sacrifice for the other may be. He would not understand why people are willing to die for another. So it is. Against this, of the Raminu Rav, Yetzer Leiv Adam, the heart of man is evil, there is the advice that wins the contest in what is the best way for man in this world of Leiv Tov, of transferring your heart from Ra, which it is biologically created to do, to rise above the mere animal and to rise above the psychiatric state that we call narcissistic personality disorder, and to give, to surrender to the other, to recognize the tov in the other. And this is actually, if there were one word that describes all the 13 attributes of God, then it is the word that God gives to all of that. When he says to Moshe, who wants to see his glory, and he says, you can't see my glory, but he says, Ani avir kol tuvi lefanecha, I will cause all my good. Vayar Elokim ki tov, God saw that it was good, and this is the way, as the Rambam so majestically describes it in Book 1, Chapter 54 of the Guide. This is the way we are supposed to live our lives, as people who are Rachum and Chanun, and so on and so forth. And that is the Lev Tov that we are called upon to create in ourselves. Man makes himself. Vayar Elokim ki tov. Yes, when God creates the world, he says it's good. And the Vayar, that God, in evil, God says that I see the world is evil. And only Noah, Kiotcha ra'iti, for you I saw tzaddik. So some say the world will end in fire. Desire, it burns. Some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, note the word tasted. It was the taste of that fruit. It was the sight of that fruit. It was tov and it was tava, and she couldn't resist. And so the poet says, as we understand, as we apply this to our lives, I hold from what I've tasted of desire, and everybody has tasted of desire. And if somebody says they have no desire for anything, no desire, then they're in depression. I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, as indeed it did, I think I know enough of hate. Hate. The other is not a person. The other is not deserving of life. Man rises against his brother and slays him. I am become death, destroyer of worlds. I think I know enough of hate, Frost tells us, to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice.